Order versus chaos. That is going to be the topic of this episode of Chi Life. So I've spent some time at a festival over the last couple of days. The festival is called Earthbeat. We have quite a few of these kind of festivals in New Zealand in the late summertime. And this type of festival, sometimes they're called conscious festivals or transformational festivals, or probably their more popular common name is Hippie Festivals. They tend not to call it that in their titles or things like that, but that's what a lot of people refer to them as. There was one guy I was talking to just walking up to one of the campsites the other day, and he was stoked. He was having a great time, and he said, "I've never seen so many hippies all in one place at once before." So they're an interesting environment, and that is what I guess gave me some inspiration to talk about this topic. I guess order versus chaos maybe sounds a little bit grandiose. Maybe a better way to put it would be structure versus creativity and exploration. But that's what I'm going to talk about. So first I'm going to talk about the festival in general as a whole, and then a bit later on I'll talk about how this applies maybe to Qigong practice and other types of practice as well. So at the festival they had a lot of the usual things that you'd expect at a hippie festival. They had music, they had art, they had food, they had shops selling, or stalls selling hippie clothing. They had workshops, lots of workshops on different topics, and some of these were there's always lots of yoga at these workshops, at these festivals. There were things on dance and creativity and expression, and this one in particular, quite a few talks about things relating to the environment and things like that. That's kind of a bit of the theme of the Earthbeat Festival. And so yeah, a lot of the normal things that you'd expect. If you've been to this kind of festival before, I don't know how many of the of you watching Chi Life have necessarily been to this type of festival. So maybe comment below if you've been to one of these conscious or transformational or hippie festivals before. Now, of course, one of the big things with the hippie culture is essentially breaking free from rules. You know, if you think back to, I guess you could say, well, there's probably ancient hippies, but we didn't call them that hippies, I don't think, years ago. When we first sort of started referring to hippies, last century sometime, it was this really countercultural revolution, breaking away from the strictures of social norms and things like that. And so there definitely is very much that kind of mentality amongst many of the people who come here, and amongst many of the sort of the events and the workshops and the things that they organize as well. That sort of flows through it to some extent. But at the same time, to organize a festival like this, I don't know how many people are here. I think it might be something like 3,000 or something. I don't know. But with multiple days of music events and workshops and all of the camping and the food and even things like taking care of the toilets and things like that, requires a huge amount of logistical effort. And so this gathering, this meeting of countercultural, do whatever you like sort of people who like to do things in an unstructured way, requires a huge amount of structure in the background for it to work. And one of the things that I actually really like about Earthbeat in particular is that, from my experience with this festival before and with the organizers, is they're really authentic. I think authentic's a good word. Authentic people. They really believe in what they're doing, and so it's not just a fairy tale idea in their head and they think everyone will just turn up, and they realize that for them to achieve something and for them to create a good experience for the people who attend this festival, that they need to be organized, but they do it in a way that aligns with their values. And so I really respect the way that they do that, and that's a big part of why actually I I came along to this one, because I've definitely had good experiences in the past with this festival and at this one as well. So we find that there needs to be this harmony between structure and this creative freedom and expression in order for the whole thing to work. And I think this applies very much to Qigong and other practices as well. And this ties in particularly at these kinds of festivals, because they're doing all these workshops on different topics and different types of practices. And it's interesting, because of the whole hippie vibe, hippie environment, a lot of those workshops have a very strong do whatever you want, do whatever you feel aspect to them, while still trying to connect into I guess more in-depth practices or traditional practices. And and some of them do it better than others, but a lot of it's really about feel whatever you feel, do whatever you like, which is interesting, because of course a lot of practices are actually quite structured. There's specific things that we do in order to get a certain result, to develop in a certain way. One of the workshops I went to, actually, I thought was an interesting illustration of this point, or something related to it. It was a dance-based session, and they had a variety of different sort of dance-related exercises to do. A lot of them were partnered, some of them were separate, and some of them, you partnered up with someone. And one of the ones they did, it was about freedom with restrictions. And the facilitator of the session, they they talked about how sometimes if you have commitments, like it might be a job or a business, or you have a relationship and there's a commitment there, this can make you feel tied down, but you can still be free within that. And so the exercise was basically one partner held the arm of the other person, and then the other person was supposed to dance and express freedom even though they had this restriction. And it was really interesting, because then the facilitators demonstrated this, and I was watching and thinking like, ooh, the way they danced, and maybe it's the way, I guess it's the way they framed this for themselves in their own mind. So the intention was to show that you could be free with restriction, but then the way they danced, really, it looked like they were handcuffed. It's like, I'm moving around, but I've got this thing tied onto my arm. But there's a whole other way you can do that, where you, instead of seeing that commitment, that relationship, whatever it is, as a restriction, you recognize it, and that you have to just be free within the restriction. You recognize that you can be empowered by that commitment, by that relationship. So far from being restricted, having, in the example of this dance, having that partner there can actually facilitate movements that would not have been possible without a partner acting as an anchor, acting as a support. They didn't really demonstrate that in this session, but in my own mind I made that connection. I thought that's an interest. It's interesting that they didn't demonstrate it, but also an interesting principle, and one that's very relevant, where sometimes we can think of commitments, relationships, and structure as something that restricts us. And if we approach it from that mindset, with that context, then it may restrict us. But when we recognize the value of structure, of commitment, and so on, it can actually empower us to do far more than we could have without it. So, okay, how does this apply to some of the practices as well? Again, many of the ones at this, and it's common at these kinds of festivals, they are very just do whatever you like. But I think there's value in that. Sometimes when we get too bound down by structure of a practice, we can lose the essence of it. We can lose the whole point behind it, and we end up adhering to the structure and losing the essence. Now, doing this explore and do whatever you feel, they're trying to connect to the essence, but often they only manage to do so in a very superficial way, because they don't actually have the benefit of that structure, of all that knowledge that's been accumulated over years within an individual's life, and then over generations of people who have worked with these different aspects of our mind, our body, our energy, to understand them. And when you have those, that can empower what it is that you explore and you experience. And so there's a balance to be found, as always, a balance between these two things, of having the structure which gives us knowledge and gives us the benefit of our teachers and those who've gone before, but then having our own personal exploration and freedom to explore within that. And I think that's the balance, really, that we each need to seek within our practice, whether that be Qigong or some other kind of practice. Certainly within what I teach, and the courses that I teach in particular, there's a lot of structure. We teach some very specific things. We teach a lot of theory. We teach particular movements. We teach very specific details of movements to understand how they work. But then also, each of the participants is encouraged to explore the movement and to find what they can feel for themselves, and even explore changing aspects of the movements to see how that changes what happens, so they end up with their own experience of what it is. And further beyond that, within the practices themselves, and if anyone watching this, if you've done a few of the courses, you'll recognize that there are some practices that are very structured, and that some actually in their very essence are less structured, and some with very little structure at all. And this also creates a harmony between having some aspects of your practice very structured and then some where it's a complete free flow. And many people actually find that very challenging. They like having the structure, they like having something to very specific to guide them. But there's this value in just exploring for yourself. And so some of the practices specifically encourage or even require you to do this in order to gain the full benefit of them. So one specific example, so in the small Universe Qigong set of practices, there's a series of different practices that we do in there. We do Waking the Qi, which activates our energy. We do 12 Rivers Qigong, which works with the organ meridians. Then we do Between Heaven and Earth, which works with the extraordinary meridians. And then we do Enter the Flow, which is a free form type of Qigong. And in terms of analogies, so Waking the Qi is like the spark. There is actually a move called lightning in it, which creates the spark, activates the energy in the first place. Then the 12 rivers, it's like rivers. The extraordinary meridians in Between Heaven and Earth, that's like ocean currents. And then the Enter the Flow is like the clouds and the rain. And so all of them are working with the energy, but with varying degrees of structure. The rivers the movements that we use for the rivers are quite structured, because rivers are quite structured. They have very specific pathways, and so the movements that most effectively stimulate them are also quite specific. The ocean currents are big and powerful, but less structured. And so for Between Heaven and Earth, working with the extraordinary meridians, the movements are big, but very simple movements with less structure in a way. Then when we get to the clouds and rain, the Enter the Flow, well, clouds and rain, clouds kind of go everywhere. And so the practice becomes unstructured, and all of these things feed together. So it's always an interesting experience coming to these festivals. And I think it's a really good thing for myself. Of course, when I'm teaching a lot, of course I'm needing to structure things in order to deliver it to people in a way that is easy for them to use and take in. So it's really good for me from time to time, as well as in my own practice, to do some unstructured practice that of course that's beneficial. But it's really good to have a counterpoint sometimes and come and play and experience and observe some of these often very unstructured types of practices and ways of working with things. I guess one of the criticisms that's sometimes leveled at the hippie community is of bastardizing or watering down different traditional practices. And I think there's some validity to that, because you see some of the things that people come up to and it's like, oh, you're kind of missing the point on some of that. Or occasionally, you know, they're doing something and it's like, oh, that's really not a good idea. There are some good reasons why in a traditional practice you don't do that. But overall, I think there's very little harm in that. It's part of just this, well, creativity and exploration. And unless someone goes deep into doing some of those things in a way that's not beneficial, generally it's not really going to cause them any problems. And this type of festival, this type of environment, it's generally not that people are going deep into anything. It's an opportunity for them to explore, to try different things, and for most of the people here, really to just explore this sort of freedom way of living, because most of them, you know, before the festival and after the festival are going to go back to their quite structured lives with regular jobs and so on. There's only a few of the very hardcore hippies, you know, amongst them. And so, you know, sometimes in that process of creativity and exploration, you know, some things don't work out in quite the right way. But at the same time, at these sorts of festivals, often they do have some people who are teaching traditional practices in an authentic way as well. You know, for example, you know, myself, I often teach workshops at these sorts of festivals, haven't at this one for a variety of reasons. And so it acts as a, you know, even people, you know, trying the ones that, you know, don't necessarily have the deep roots, it can act as an entry point. And those who do want to actually go deeper and further, that's probably something that they'll do in their regular day-to-day lives. But this, you know, these festivals create this opportunity to kind of break free and try different things and all that sort of thing. So anyway, that is my musings on order versus chaos. Ideally, what we want in our practice is to use the structure to support us in our own experience of our energy. Not to be confined by the structure, not to be restricted by it, but use it for its value in helping us to have an even richer experience for ourselves. I hope you've enjoyed the vlog. If you have, please like, comment, subscribe, share, all those good things, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.